Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson, and today it's my privilege to be joined by Lesley Gordon, who's professor of history at the University of Akron, and the author of A Broken Regiment, the 16th Connecticut's Civil War, which is now out with LSU Press. So Dr. Gordon, thanks so much for taking some time to talk with us today.
Thank you.
Now, regimental histories are really interesting, and I think it's particularly illustrative when you discuss them at the beginning in your introduction, and that at times there are some people who are very reticent to read into them, who believe that there's obviously a bit of an agenda at work behind some of these older regimentals, but that obviously has not stopped you. But before we get into the book itself, I wondered if you could perhaps give us a sense of what drew you towards the 16th Connecticut to begin with, because obviously there are so many units to choose. What drew you to this regiment from the Nutmeg State?
Well, I came across them reading Stephen Sears' Landscape Turn Red many, many years ago. They're mentioning them in his book briefly, what happened to them, how horrible it was for them, and then they disappear from the story. And it just made me wonder what happened next and what brought them to that moment. And I honestly thought this would be a brief article. I thought that maybe I could do something with Antietam myself, and that would be the end of it. I had no idea this would actually end up as a book, and I had no idea it would take so many years to write it. So that really is what spurred it. I happen to be from Connecticut, and that was I don't have any relations or anybody that was in the war in the 16th, but it helped me in the sense that I'm familiar with the places. I grew up in a couple of the towns from the book, and so that gave an interesting sense of immediacy in writing the book.
Now, how did you approach researching the 16th? Because there's obviously a whole host of different avenues that you could go down, between correspondence from some of these soldiers, from personal collections, and there's obviously newspapers and things like that. And I guess, so that's part one of the question. And part two is, in your mind, what is the inherent value of a regimental history for those that appreciate reading more about the Civil War?
Well, my first book was a biography. It ended up to be a biography of two people in many ways, more than one, a biography of Confederate General George Pickett. And I'm very much drawn to stories of individuals. So I have to admit I was put off a little bit by the daunting task of writing about potentially 1,000 people, which is what a regiment is. But I did want to do something different in writing my second monograph. But I consider myself a military historian. I wanted to do something about common soldiers. And I thought this was a great vehicle to do that and explore the North and ask questions about memory, ask questions about motivation, ask questions about combat. So that all kind of came together in looking at a single regiment. And then, of course, when you're doing that, you start to read a lot of regimentals to look for models. And I became both drawn to them, and also disappointed in them, and feeling that they didn't seem to have the sort of innovation that I was finding in so many of the other new types of Civil War history. Because one of the things I say in my book is I just feel like there's so much great work going on in our field, but I feel like the regimental is the one type of history that hasn't been sort of reinvented, right? I think we've had wonderfully new ways of thinking about biography, thinking about battle history. Think of somebody like George Rabel's book on Fredericksburg, certainly thinking about bringing in these new questions of gender and social and cultural history, broadly conceived. But I just thought the regimental just really intrigued me in tackling that and writing about it differently.
Now, what of the 16th Connecticut? Who are these men that take up arms and head off in the summer of 1862? Where are they coming from in the state? What types of socioeconomic backgrounds were you able to determine that comprised the men from this unit?
Right, so even though I'm trying to write a regimental history, in many ways this is not a traditional regimental history and it's not a comprehensive history of them, but I do try to get a sense of who they were as much as possible. They are representative both of the typical Union unit and of their region. About a third of them, from what I could tell, were farmers. The rest, very much reflecting the changes of New England and the North. You're going to find businessmen, teachers, lawyers, artisans. I think there was, there's about maybe 13% immigrants, which is actually lower than the average Union unit. The average age was not too far off from James McPherson's. I think that was about 24 years old. So there's some variations within the unit. They certainly did have their share of recruits. So I feel like in many ways they are your typical unit. They don't have typical things happen to them, but you can certainly make the argument, who's really typical, but they're not that unusual for looking at a unit that comes into form in the summer of '62, that second wave of volunteers, and the mixture of reasons why they join. You find everything that you would expect. You find men that are saying things that they're joining because of sort of pure patriotism. They're fighting for the Union. You also find some expressions of abolition, and then men that are joining because they want the bounty. They need the money. They're trying to support their families. They're looking for adventure. So everything that people like James McPherson and others have been talking about in motivation, sort of cause and comrades, I found that all in these men in their expressions of why they join.
Now, as you mentioned, this is a unit that forms in the summer of '62, and they see the elephant September 17th, 1862, at the Battle of Antietam. And I'll let you describe how that performance goes for these men, and as this is their first true experience in combat, and obviously quite a harrowing experience for it to be the Battle of Antietam.
Right, and so they are formed in the summer, and they leave Connecticut in late August, and within 3 weeks they're in battle. That's not unusual, and I want to stress that again. That's what's so interesting about this unit. But they decide that it's unusual. That's also one of the tensions in the narrative that they start to sort of spin for themselves, that they've been badly treated, that they are somehow different than everybody else. But there are going to be a lot of green units at Antietam because it is one of the early battles. But they have a unit that's raised also from Harford County alongside them, the 14th Connecticut. The 14th Connecticut and the 16th Connecticut leave Harford about the same time, go to Antietam. But the 14th Connecticut performs very well at the Battle of Antietam. The 16th Connecticut, however, goes into battle late in the day. They're just below Burnside's Bridge. They take the bulk of the Confederate attack. That's Hill's arrival on the field, and they are completely just dispersed, and they panic, and they flee. And I take the name of the book. It's from a Rhode Island officer who is describing what happens to his own men, the 4th Rhode Island. They also break and flee, but he's talking about the 16th, and he's talking about how their panic led to his own units complete breakdown. And so this catastrophe really for this unit, they never really recover from. Their numbers never really recover. They suffer about 25% casualty rate, and that's going to be wounded, dead, missing, and prisoners. And the men are very, very honest about it. They just say they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand the commands. They're getting shots from all sides, and they're in a cornfield. The corn's very high, and they just scatter. Some of them hide in the woods all night long. Some of them never come back. There's accounts of some of these guys just leaving the battlefield. At least 2 of them end up going to England for the rest of the war. So it's very dramatic. And some of them, of course, do come back and serve. But I found that very striking, and some of them talk bluntly and candidly about how scared they were, and even use the word coward. They say, I was a coward, I ran, and I had never come across that before. All my reading of the Civil War, I'd never read soldiers talk about battle that way and the sheer fear. We know, of course, that soldiers are very interested or very concerned with how they perform during their first battle, but I'd never seen soldiers talk about fear with that much, that much honesty. So it really was a changing moment for the regiment in so many ways.
Now, one of the most intriguing things, I think, as I was combing my way through this book, is the fact that when you're dealing with the regimental history, yes, you've got obviously the soldiers, the men of the regiment, but their letters home, they're writing to somebody, and that these are family members, and you allude to the fact, right, that some of them even come to visit the unit or during the course of the war. So I wondered, by looking at the letters back home, obviously most often to loved ones, be they wives, girlfriends, mothers, sisters, even fathers, what types of relationships do you detect as you're looking at this? And then how does that give you a sense of how these men are constructing a sense of community?
Yes, I wanted to, as much as I could, understand those relationships and that sense of tie between the home front and the battlefront. And that's something that I've been sensitive to in my own work throughout. Going back to my work on Pickett, is that those sort of, if you will, intimate relationships. Because I think that it's artificial for historians to try to separate them. And of course, we know soldiers, who were they writing to? They were writing to their wives or mothers, in many cases, and obviously also fathers and sons and what have you, but civilians. And we don't often have the civilians writing to the soldiers. Sometimes we do, and sometimes I did in this case. I sometimes had both sides in a dialogue. But I wanted to, like you said, I wanted to get a sense of that community of the home front and what that was like for the 16th. And it was striking. These civilians, of course, they're worried, they're concerned. In the case of Antietam, they want news. They're, as all civilians were throughout the war, really struggling to find accurate information, and they're not getting accurate information. They're getting driblets of information, and there's exaggerations in the newspaper. And I talk quite a bit about that, about what's in. I use newspapers quite a bit in the book, sensitive to the political affiliations of these different newspapers. And also, I found it quite interesting that a lot of the men had connections to the local newspapers. But so these people at home, they're trying to find the information they can, and of course there are the personal letters, and they're getting different stories about what actually happened to them in Antietam. A lot of the first press, of course, is very positive, but then it starts to leak that things didn't go quite as well for the men. Now, John Kusner, the one I mentioned, he talks about. In fact, he said, "I was a coward at Antietam," and he tells this to his sweetheart, just tells her straight out. And these are in their private letters to each other, which are preserved, and they're quite remarkable. That you have them going back and forth. So you see that on the personal level, their relationship that's starting to evolve throughout the war. There are times where he's worried that she's forgotten about him, and of course there are times when you see these women dealing with the separation and the difficulties of missing their husbands, their sweethearts, their sons, and worried. I also found very, very revealing to go through the governor's papers, because a lot of these civilians would be writing to the governor. Early in the war, they just want information. They want if these men might be in the hospital or even the conditions of the camp. But then when it got really bleak, when they end up in Andersonville, they're demanding answers. They want an exchange. They want their men home. And so it's constant. And so there's really, as I said, there's really no separation in, the men are at the front, they're fighting, and the civilians are at home. And to me, there's just, it's really an important dynamic to understand this, because this is these people's lives, right? And I try to do that throughout the book, is understand that.
Now, following Antietam, the unit is at Fredericksburg, although are not prominently involved, I guess we should say. And then ultimately, their base of operations is shifted to Virginia and then North Carolina, predominantly in garrison duty, as you point out. But things change in the spring of 1864 for a significant portion of the unit. So why don't you take us through some of those events?
Right, after Antietam, and they really are in bad shape as far as numbers go. And the other thing that happens to them is a lot of their officers resign. They just go home. Whether they've decided the war isn't for them, some of them are angry they're not getting the promotions they wanted, or the war's not what they expected it to be. And so the regiment's in bad shape, and I could never put my finger on the idea that maybe they're no longer trusted, but it's certainly a question after their poor performance at Antietam. So they're going to be at Fredericksburg, and they're going to be largely, as you said, they're observers. There was this question of whether, right, Burnside was going to lead the ninth, his Ninth Corps in this suicidal attack the second day, and that didn't happen. So that would have been the 16th. But anyway, after that, they're just going to be, as you mentioned, in sort of garrison duty. They will fight at Suffolk, which is sort of more, I call it a skirmish in comparison to some of these larger battles. The numbers are not nearly that very large. But for the 16th, this is an important experience for them. They talk about it, that they're proving to each other that they can fight and fight well. They hold out. They seem to have very low stragglers, desertion, which was all those things, of course, were such problems in Antietam. And following Suffolk, then they're going to settle into these garrison locations. There'll be raids. There's something called the Blackberry Raid, which was going on while Gettysburg was going on. So they're suffering certainly from sickness. They're going to be marching around, but it's nothing compared to what the active front, what's going on there. But for them, this is their war, and they feel that they're not being appreciated. They feel that they're not being paid for quite a while. This makes them very angry, and they actually threaten to just go home at one point. They eventually make their way to Plymouth, or I should say to Portsmouth, before that, Portsmouth, Virginia, where they're extremely comfortable, and they're actually enjoying themselves. They build themselves comfortable quarters, cabins with wooden floors. They have a church. They have a theater. I say in the book, it's almost like not being at war at all. But they still complain. And then they're told that they have to move again. And they're so angry, they burn the entire camp down, which I found, it's quite striking. And again, this unit, this is just, they have this strong voice of who they are. A lot of their officers are arrested and court-martialed for this event, that they will be moved to Plymouth, where they feel they are basically the edge of the world. They feel, again, they've been forgotten. They're convinced nothing's going to happen to them there. And then, of course, in April, they're attacked by the Confederates. And on April 20th, their position is it has been surrounded, and they surrender, and they are captured. And pretty much the whole regiment, there's one company that escapes capture. They were removed early before the fighting really started to take civilians out of Plymouth, and so the rest of the regiment is sent to Andersonville. And so this, for me, these are the bookends of their experience. You have Antietam, where they break and run, and you have Andersonville, where they're going to suffer for several months. And about 400 of them go into the prison, and from the numbers are, they're hard to know for sure, but I say about a third of them, just not quite 100 of them, maybe. Then some of them are going to die in other prisons, and some of them are going to die from their sufferings in general of imprisonment. But it is a harrowing, of course, experience for them, and this is their Civil War experience. They will be exchanged eventually. They will come to Camp Parole in some of them late in 64 and then early 65, and serve out the rest of their time in the military, and then come home.
But things are far from over, obviously. Once the war ends, I suppose you could say the pens start to flourish. And I found this to be, it's really very interesting. I think really one of the most dynamic elements of your book is looking into how different men of the unit try to construct the unit's memory, if you will, their regimental identity in a post-war world, and the evolution, I guess we can say, of that identity from wartime to post-war. So what types of things are we looking at here in terms of the evolution of how the 16th is remembered?
Yeah, so what I feel is happening is they're coming home, and because they have the shadow of imprisonment, uh, particularly hanging over them, they're part of course, this general movement toward commemoration that, as we know, is particularly going to take off once we get into the 1880s, 1890s, turn of the century. I mean, some of them are starting it earlier, but it's really going to take off by the latter part of the 19th century. Is that they want their story told. They want to be there also at Antietam. They want to be remembered. But what is this? What is that story? And it's difficult for them, and so they begin to craft it along a narrative that's, I'm arguing, is a generic one. It's got to be heroic, of course, and it's got to sort of fit these contours. And so they're not going to tell the parts about Antietam where they're running away and hiding in the woods and being scared. They are going to talk quite a bit about being green, but it's this, instead it's flipped so that they're green and they're inexperienced, but they hold on and they're brave. So they become the brave 16th. In fact, that's what you start to see in the newspaper accounts of their veteran reunions, in the public records, of their veteran activities, that they're now the brave 16th, the courageous 16th. And then what happens with the rest of their service, there's nothing mentioned, of course, of their threats of mutiny. There's nothing mentioned of their burning their camp down. None of that. That's all going to be gone and sanitized and wiped clean. And their experience of Andersonville, in many ways, will particularly purify them. And I mean that, and I think there's Christian elements to it too. I think that they really felt that they had sacrificed themselves as martyrs. There's some really powerful words that they use. One of the things that I didn't mention, at Plymouth, they had their regimental flags, right, were in threat of being captured by the Confederates. And there's this powerful moment. And from what I could tell, originally I didn't even think the story was true. That's when you're working on something a long time, you go through a process, you're questioning things, you're wondering about things. But I came to believe that it was true in the end. But their regimental flags, they're ordered to save them by their lieutenant colonel, and they do. And some of them are apparently just destroyed, hidden, but many of them, the state flag in particular, they tear it up and they hide it, in their uniform. They disperse it. And some of them bring those scraps with them into prison and keep them through those many, many months suffering in Andersonville. And so when they come back to these reunions and are recounting their time together, those scraps serve as the symbol of their suffering, and they create a new flag, and this flag you can see today. It's at the Connecticut Capitol. And it's an all-white flag, but in the center are those scraps. And I think of course, it's very symbolic of their resurrection of a unit that was troubled and fragile and literally broken, and then came out renewed from the suffering. And what I think also is so interesting about it is, imprisonment was not necessarily seen as conventionally heroic at the time of the Civil War. And they talk about this themselves when they're in prison. I have a lot of their diaries, and they say how unmanly they feel and how helpless they feel because there's nothing they can do. They're not fighting. They're just sitting and suffering and waiting and very, very sick, starving. And, many of them were religious. Ira Forbes, who I talk quite a bit about, he's praying and hoping, of course, to get out and survive this, and thinking that God is testing him, convinced that this is somehow a challenge to his faith. And I think many of them went through this. It was a real soul searching for them to come out on the other side of it and to somehow feel that prison experience did make them just as good, just as brave, as any soldier who was at Gettysburg, as any soldier who was at, who fought in the wilderness, that they could stand there next to those veterans and hold their heads high. And this meant the world to them. They were very, very proud of it. So this is what happens.
Well, Dr. Gordon, truly a really, really fascinating study here. Again, everyone, that's A Broken Regiment, the 16th Connecticut Civil War. It's out with LSU Press. Frankly, a unit that I did not know much about prior to, hearing you speak about this unit a couple of years ago, certainly. But now, with the book out, it's truly a very interesting story, one that, as you mentioned, helps to blur that line between battlefield and home front. I think it's a very important distinction that people, and I certainly think Civil War scholarship is moving in that direction and people are becoming more aware of that, but regimentals certainly need to reflect that. And finally, post-war memory. It's fascinating to look at it on a regimental level, particularly with a unit such as this, who have to overcome so much to be part of that narrative. One that doesn't involve them, triumphantly being with the Army of the Potomac through the course of the war or something of that nature, but one that comes in at Antietam and languishes extensively at Andersonville, really much almost as an entire unit. So, Dr. Gordon, thank you so much for taking some time to talk about this work, and hopefully we can have you on in the future to talk about the next project, which I'm sure you're already in the midst of.
All right, thank you, Dave.